name is Melanie Carter. I'm Director of the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy at Howard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to this session with our guest, Dr. Felecia Commodore. Of course, this session will be talking about the Carnegie Classification System and HBCUs. Specifically, the title is Understanding HBCU Research Designations and Their Impact on Institutional Growth. So Dr. Commodore certainly is an expert in this area, has written widely on the issue of Carnegie classification and HBCUs. And so we're pleased to have her today for this session. So Dr. Commodore, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carter, and thank you to the HBC Center for inviting me here to talk and share in conversation with you on this topic. My name is Felecia Commodore. I am an associate professor of higher education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I currently do research on leadership, governance, and administrative practices with a particular focus on historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions. And overall, look at issues and happenings around organizational behavior, organizational culture, organizational decision-making and decision-making processes within the higher education landscape, and really looking at how institutions make decisions, why they make the decisions they make, and how that has implications overall for institutional culture and the execution of their mission.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Well, we want to dive right into this topic. As I mentioned earlier, the title of this session is Understanding the HBCU Research Designations and Their Impact on Institutional Growth. And so, of course, as you well know, there's been a lot of attention given to this topic in recent months, namely because Carnegie issued a new listing of research universities, and Howard is now R1 institution. It's had that status, of course, in the past, but it's the only HBCU with R1 designation. However, the other two research designations, R2, and then research colleges and universities, I think is a new category. And there again, so that expands the list of HBCUs who are considered research institutions. And so there's been a lot of conversation about what that means versus HBCUs, et cetera. And so I want to begin with an opening sort of question about the kind of, I won't say it's a race because I don't think it's a race, but it is sort of a goal for many HBCUs to achieve status as a research institution, specifically Research One, but also Research Two, and now certainly with this third category, there'll be some movement toward that. So I'm wondering, Dr. Commodore, what you make of that. Is that a worthy goal for HBCUs, or what are some considerations that they might have as it relates to pursuing research status?
Congratulations to Howard being the first to garner that R1 designation. That's so exciting. I think I would say there's nuance to it. I think broadly speaking, it's a win. And because these institutions are, Howard's getting R1 status. We had a number of institutions also be able to get R2 status, which in my work, I found that most of our HBCUs are actually trying to get to the R2 status. There's a smaller group that's trying to get to R1. But I think it's not just that they got the status, but it was the reworking of the classification statuses that ACE and Carnegie worked very hard on. A lot of the conversations I was a part of and that I heard were going on between some of the HBCU leadership and Carnegie. There was some tension around what it would look like to really revisit these statuses and what were the ways that these statuses were upholding inequities within higher education. And so there were these tensions around kind of the what the intent of R1 status was and what it actually was doing, right? And so there were folks who say, oh, well, it's just a status, right? It's just a classification. It's just to help us understand institutions, right? It doesn't mean anything. But what we were hearing from leaders, from research VPs, was that in actuality and in practice, these classifications were in ways keeping HBCUs out of the room and not at the table for certain conversations, particularly around resource flow. Right. And so whether or not the intention, the statuses were to create barriers or to make assumptions about the capacity of institutions, in practice, it was in fact doing that. And the other conversation that was happening was that some of the metrics that were being used for these classifications were for HBCUs particularly forcing them to be at this crossroads of having to choose between these statuses and their mission, right? And there was kind of a question of why should these institutions who whose mission is so important and so integral to who they are and how they, serve and produce in the higher education ecosystem, why should they have to choose between that and then engaging in these activities to try and get resources, right? And so it became around how do we engage in the classification system in a way that helps us understand who these institutions are and what they do, but also does so in a way that is more equitable and allows for more institutions to have access to resources and conversations to develop resources. And so I think overall, and I've had some conversations with folks that are on both sides, right? Like,
Mhm.
does it really do nothing for us?
Yes.
And also like, yay, we finally got the status. But I think overall the win is that they did revisit the nature and the formula around the classifications in ways that broke down barriers that were causing inequities. And there may be naysayers or critics who'll say, oh, well, they watered down the classifications. And I push back at that because I don't think it's watering down to say we should care about your mission, right? I
Mhm.
think that's some like capitalistic ways
Mhm.
of thinking about value.
Mhm.
And so I think it's less about that. I don't think it changed the rigor or the research level that's necessary to reach these classifications, but more so it acknowledged the nuanced work that institutions like HBCUs are doing while they're doing research at a high activity level as many of their peers. And while many of their peers are doing that high research level activity level, but not servicing students and communities in having a mission of uplift and access in the ways that HBCUs do.
Sure. And I really appreciate what you said earlier about this whole idea of the equity lens and thinking about the classification, because I do think you're right. Keeping in mind the various things the university does. How does HBCU have a history of teaching, also a history of working with students who perhaps enrolling students who are perhaps less prepared, not always, but certainly less prepared, or certainly requiring more resources, more uh, different kinds of engagement from their faculty in terms of that. And so that's interesting. And also the categories around certainly dependent upon two factors, which would be research expenditures and doctoral students, um,
Hmm.
who the number of doctoral students who they graduate each year. And so again, some of these institutions, based upon those, sort of very rigid uh, criteria, might automatically be really not in the running for that status. And really, though, as we think about it, the research status, what does it bring to an institution?
Mm.
Okay. So if in fact these various designations, are currency in the academy or currency in higher education, what does that currency look like for HBCUs?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When I talked with different VPs of
Mhm.
research and also sponsored program officers at HBCUs, as well as I talked to a few provosts and presidents, one of the things that we heard consistently was that when we look at NSF grants, NIH grants, and we know all of that is hot fodder right now.
It sure is extremely hot
But
poverty.
traditionally,
Okay.
when we looked at the kind of the major, the NSFs, the NIH grants, which were big parts and portions in being able to reach R1 status, uh, what they were the HBCs were experiencing is they would have really strong grant applications to these agencies. But because they were designated as HBCUs, because they were not one institutions or even sometimes R2 institutions, although they were doing the research,
Mhm.
although they could prove they had, at least on paper, the capacity to do the work, that there would be this discriminatory practices in essence of an assumption that they could not handle these grants, right? And so HBCUs are being left out of access. Again, we're talking about millions of dollars that, and I want to say this because I think with the current conversation, there's been some propaganda that like these millions of dollars are helping, I don't know, faculty buy mansions. You and I know that's not the truth, right?
Absolutely.
But a
Absolutely
lot
not.
of, right? But these are millions of dollars that go towards capacity building at the institution, making sure, giving access to graduate school and um, tuition payment opportunities for students. So ultimately, giving opportunities for students to go to school and have it paid for, and when they wouldn't, being able to develop um, products and research and development that, particularly for HBCUs, often connected right back to either local communities, Black communities, people of color. We found a lot of the research that was happening at HBCUs actually was connected to disparities and issues within the community, right?
Mhm.
And so, simply because they didn't have a certain classification or that or for these unfounded assumptions of what these HBCUs couldn't handle, which in turn kept them away from resources that could help them actually engage in more robust work and create more robust access, right? And then it would became a vicious cycle in which you then turn around and say, well, you all need to be doing more research. And it's like, well, we need more support to do the research.
Sure.
Or they were being pushed and in essence kind of unofficially forced to partner with PWIs
Mhm.
to do the work. Even though they would be doing a bulk of the work,
Sure. Sure.
they would have to be getting the money funneled to them from these larger PWIs who would be taking a good portion of the money, right? And so, which mirrors a lot of history around
That's right.
exploitive labor
Exactly.
and Black
That's
folks,
right.
right?
That's right. That's
So,
right.
and so it wasn't just like these statuses, they not having them created barriers for institutions and at the very least opened up the door to justify discriminatory funding practices. I think the other thing we heard, particularly from presidents, was that there were conversations within their states, within different associations, within different funding groups or philanthropic groups, policy spaces that they just weren't being invited to,
Mhm.
simply because they were not R1 institutions. And so the question then becomes, what voices left off out of the conversation when HBCUs aren't there,
That's right.
right? And the status again, um, not having the status that isn't connected to actually not having done the work, right? You're
Mhm.
doing
Mhm.
the work,
Right.
but you're not getting the status for it or the acknowledgement of it. And that opens the door for people to exclude you from a conversation.
That's
And
right.
so we begin to make, if we're honest, we have a small group of institutions influencing policy and decisions that are going to affect all of us in higher education.
Sure.
And so it was really challenging Carnegie to say, what does this mean for HBCUs if we continue to engage in a practice that helps discriminate against them, to exclude them
Mhm.
from the conversation, to kind of make them a set aside as opposed to an integral part of the higher education ecosystem. And how does that affect us all across the higher education ecosystem? So I think when we ask the question, like, what does it really mean for
Mhm.
institutions? I think for HBCUs, it meant having a seat at the table, right? It meant having a voice in the conversation. And I think that's really important, especially as we think about the overwhelming amount and percentage of Black students, um, financially needy students, under-resourced students that HBCUs give access to, and the ways in which they also are such economic drivers within the states that they reside in, the local communities they reside in. We really need them in that conversation about where we're going in higher education, what we're doing in higher education. And then ultimately, we can't knock that it does give some prestige and some marketing ability to
That's right.
institutions, not just for students, but also for faculty looking for
Mhm.
jobs,
That's right.
for funders looking for partnerships.
Mhm.
And that's very real. So there is a capital element
Mhm.
to having this status, and I don't think that can be ignored either.
Right. Very, very good. And I agree. And I also think your point about partnerships, I think is extremely important because oftentimes PWIs and other institutions look to HBCUs for a variety of reasons. One, they have great researchers, also great access to data about students
Yeah.
we often serve. And so often HBCUs are, as you use the phrase, which I hadn't thought of before, in relation to higher education, a set aside. So this idea that you have to partner with some entity like an HBCU or some other entity in order to justify your particular project. And so HBCUs were often bombarded with these opportunities, but really not benefiting. At least it wasn't a
Exactly.
mutually beneficial in the same kind of way, and that's very important in terms of that. Think about that currency. I like that. I like that very much. And I also think that this issue of changing the criteria is a really interesting conversation because, again, when that is coupled with the announcement about some HBCUs either achieving a different rank or becoming a research university, it can
Mhm.
minimize that achievement or still sort of cast aspersions on these institutions as needing some special step up. Um,
Right.
and I do think, in terms of thinking about that criteria and what that means for HBCUs, in terms of their inclusion in some of these categories, I think it's important. Um, my light goes off in my office automatically. Okay, okay, but great, great. And so if we think about these HBCUs, some, as you said, a few are attempting to pursue research one status, and then there are others who are attempting to pursue research two. Certainly, this issue of mission comes up time and time again. HBCUs, as we mentioned earlier, certainly we're dealing with, we often have faculty who are stretched. We have students who
Yes.
perhaps need additional support. The institution's resources in terms of capacity to actually support a research project or a large grant sometimes is not as steady as some other institutions. So what kinds of things um, might HBCUs need to do or think of doing as they consider pursuing a different research uh, or kind of Carnegie designation?
Yeah, that is a really great question.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, as part of my work, I talk to a number of faculty across different types of HBCUs about their relationship with the classification system, with the relationship with their institution, if there have been conversations about striving towards these different statuses or moving toward from being like a regionally comprehensive institution or a teaching
Mm-hmm.
intensive institution to a R2 or trying to move from a R2 to a R1. And overwhelmingly,
Mm-hmm.
faculty were like, I don't have a problem
Mm-hmm.
with it, but you can't tell us you want us to do more and still do what we're doing because
Mm-hmm.
we're all stretched, like you said, to capacity, right?
Capacity, right.
And so I think that when institutional leaders are thinking about moving towards more research intensive statuses. And I often think institutional leadership are thinking about the larger organizational benefits, right? I think it's really important to one, have faculty as part of that conversation, but really there needs to be some interrogation of what are the cultural things in your institution that may need to be shifted because they're going to cause barriers to the new things you're asking your faculty to do, right? So if we're asking faculty to submit at least two major grant applications a semester or a year, which for folks who don't have to do that, those they're very time intensive, they take a lot of coordination, a lot of work. You can't also then expect your faculty to do high quality teaching at a 4 or 5 load,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially when we look at some of their institutional counterparts outside of the sector who get course buyouts to do grants,
Mm-hmm.
who have research assistants to help them with grants, or whole departments or administrative staff to help them with these things, right? So it's not simply asking or saying that, okay, we want to reach this status, we need to do XYZ to get there, and we need faculty to help us along the way. And I do want to say, and a lot of times faculty are already doing work, they're already doing research, they're applying for grants. But also we need to think about how do we need to address the organizational structure and processes and culture that can create barriers for faculty to achieve the things that we're asking them to do. And that could be everything from teaching loads to advising loads. You know, we at our HBCUs, a lot of times faculty also serve as advisors. And that's really important work, right? We don't want to, this is where the mission and the striving can sometimes rub, because that advising work is what leads to retention and graduation, right?
Absolutely.
And that high touch approach that happens at many HBCUs. But we need to be cognizant of that. We also thinking about processes. I had talked to one faculty member, I remember when they were like, oh, I had to like walk over to the grant soft sponsor programs office with a triplicate. So, and so just thinking about we streamline some of these processes, or find technologies to put in place to help support our faculty and what we need them to do in order to help us reach this status. Now, the reality is all of that becomes a delicate dance of conversation around capacity, resources, and just organizational change, because there were some faculty that were like they say this stuff every year. Every year they say we striving for something. I'm just going to keep doing my work. I'm not worried about them people, right? So so also some change management conversations, especially at institutions who have very strongly seen their identity as teaching intensive. It can be really challenging for faculty, for staff, for student support folks to see how to see a benefit to changing their identity towards the status in ways that the administration see it. And one of the things I say colloquially kind of with folks is that sometimes HBCUs are like black churches, right? And that you have the official board or the deacon board and then the pastor, and they're like they'll be looking at the pastor like, you'll be gone before I'll be gone, right? And so I'm just gonna hold out. Right? You have all these plans and these great ideas, but you'll be gone in 3 years and I'll still be here, right? And so that's a very real culture that can happen. And so I think as administrators and leaders are looking at how we move institutions towards these statuses. One, we have to really engage in shared governance and bring faculty, staff, research staff into conversations. But we also really need to think about change management. How are we intentional and strategic in how we help move people from one identity to the other identity without our institutions going through an identity crisis?
I love that whole piece around organizational change. That really is about a culture change and making sure that the organization is agile enough to really put those things in place over time, incrementally, because it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah,
But certainly,
absolutely.
yeah.
And
And the other,
sometimes
go
leaders
ahead.
have these lofty, like, we're going to
Exactly.
go from teaching intensive to R2
Exactly.
in 3
Exactly.
years. And I don't know if that's
Yeah. I don't know if
realistic,
that's
right?
reasonable. And also,
Yeah.
I don't know, also, I was really, of course, taking a very close look when at the um, designations when they were released, and certainly noticed some trends, um, R1, Howard achieved that status again. Then there, R2, we saw 3 or 4 new
Yes.
entries, one removed. And then the research college universities included a whole swath of new institutions,
Yeah.
but land grants were on. One thing I did notice that all the land grants are now designated, the 1890 land grant institutions are designated as research universities. And some other
Hmm.
kinds of trends I thought were very, very interesting. But the piece too is that I haven't done this work, but certainly thinking now, as you said, talked about resources, whether that be additional resources or support for faculty so they have time, whether it be buyout or making sure that you have a sponsored research office that can actually provide the kind of support that's necessary in order to manage or to even sort of pursue funding.
Hmm.
The other thing is that in terms of just sheer numbers, I
Mm.
often wonder, if at an HBCU, for example, and Howard's one of the larger ones, but certainly there are larger HBCUs in Howard, although I think they're most comprehensive in terms of our various schools and colleges and professional schools. But if you think about the number of faculty who need to be engaged in the research enterprise at a smaller campus versus the number of faculty in terms of
Hmm.
percentages that need to be involved in research. So really, it is a huge lift for
Yes.
HBCUs because of just in terms of the numbers. I mean, how many people do you need to reach this, whatever the expenditure level is for that category, and how many programs do you have that need to support doctoral students or PhD students? So again, this issue of uh, proportionality in terms of,
Right,
do you
right.
have the people literally, or
Yes.
are you going to expect, while only maybe 15% of the people at Ohio State have to do it, or 40%, maybe 65% have to do it at a
Right.
smaller institution, and what that really means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm glad you talked about trends. I think if you look at um both Howard, but
Mhm,
also a number of the institutions that
mhm,
were at the R2 status, I think one of the trends you'll see is some of them are very strong
mhm,
STEM programs,
mhm,
um, which again, STEM, health sciences, those areas tend to get those really big NSF, NIH grants, right? IES grant.
mhm.
Um, but also a number of them have some kind of research center,
Sure.
right? We think about Hampton and their cancer
Mhm,
research center, and some of the different, Prairie View has a number of
mhm,
research centers. And so, to your point about having people power, those research centers allow us to hire like
mhm,
these kind of concentrated groups of
mhm.
people dedicated to research,
That's right. That's right.
which can help take some of that lift off of folks who are there primarily for teaching, right? And so I think that's something we're seeing at a number of
Mhm,
HBCUs who are striving for R1 status,
sure.
and R2 status is seeing more conversations about research centers
Mhm.
being there, and that being an opportunity to create more capacity to go after grants and to engage in research development.
Absolutely. And I'm also, I mean, even though I don't want to believe that what we're experiencing right now will be, I always think about HBCUs in the 22nd century, not
Yeah.
necessarily the 21st. So I'm hoping that the legacy of some of the decisions now won't continue to impact HBCUs, but certainly for folks striving to maintain or attain
Right,
or
right.
a particular status. If we talk about NIH funding or NSF, I mean, there really is going to be, it seems to me, some impact that will affect these institutions'
Absolutely.
ability to secure these grants And of course, that will mean that, maintaining these statuses will be very difficult.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting the day kind of the press went out
Hmm.
about Howard getting the R1 status. It was either like the day after, or it was around the same week that the executive order
Right.
around the NSF grants and all
Hmm.
the grants came out. So I remember talking to some colleagues, like we were all like, "Yay!" But also, "Ooh,
Ooh,
like,
yeah,
what does it
exactly.
mean?"
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's almost felt like, we get one step forward and they
Right.
just two steps back, right?
Exactly.
So, but I do think it is something to think about because again, when we looked at a lot of the research that HBCUs are doing, as we would assume, a lot of it is around Black communities,
That's right.
Black
There it
disparities,
is. Uh-huh.
thinking of ways of innovation to help Black communities and Black access and Black health and all of these things.
Hmm.
And so I think there is a conversation to be had about what does that mean for the work that is a bulk of is happening at HBCUs in an environment where we don't want to talk about race and we don't want to talk
Hmm.
about inequity and we don't
Exactly.
want to talk about discriminatory practices.
Hmm.
So I think that is a conversation I imagine is happening across campuses. I think, and I'm not always optimistic, but I tend to be optimistic in this
Okay.
area.
Okay.
So I always tell people, catch it when you can, right? So, um, think when I call back to what I said about how HBCUs have experienced both the classification system, but ultimately the research development, research resources, environment, ecosystem. I don't know if there's a better sector that has had to figure out how to do the work when nobody wanted to give them money to do the work.
That's right. That's so true.
Right. And one thing I think about the HBCU sector is that they have, unfortunately, but in this case, maybe fortunately, always had to learn how to dance with federal administration, federal guidelines that would seek to make their work hard,
Hmm. Hmm.
to would seek to block the work that they're
Hmm.
doing, to
Hmm.
seek to create inequitable access for them. And they have found ways over and over and over again to triumph and break through those barriers. Even though we ultimately want to get rid of those barriers,
Hmm.
I think the HBCU sector, probably more than any other sector,
Hmm.
can look at what's happening now for in the area of policy and practices and say, okay, this here we go again,
Hmm.
right? And so they have playbooks, in my opinion, to figure out. Although this is different than it's been before, it's not new. It's new to some other sectors
Sure.
who's not used to having this kind of pressure on
That's
them.
right. That's right. That's right.
But I don't think it's new to the HBCU sector. They have had to dance with state legislatures, federal government, these
Philanthropists, the private donors.
philanthropists, funding
Hmm.
agencies. They have had to learn how to do these dances and to continue to serve their students and their communities and do this research and do this work when everything would come against them to be able to do it. And so if there's any sector that I think will actually rise to the occasion of still being able to do this high level of research activity
Hmm.
in the face of such an unstable environment,
Hmm. Hmm.
I think it'll be the HBCU sector.
Yeah, I agree. And I tend to be an optimistic person, although lately I'm feeling less so. But certainly I believe and I certainly have hope, okay, that that
Yeah,
will be the
yeah,
case. Because I definitely, as you said, there's certainly empirical evidence that
yes,
HBCUs have weathered many storms, no, though not identical to this one, very, very similar. I mean, certainly when we look at the
yeah.
core elements. Well, certainly your expertise, your perspective is extremely helpful. And not only that, so important to all of us. But I have one final question. I could talk with you about this all day, but I won't do that to you. But I do have one question about um, what you think our strategy should be forward. Should we think about this as individual institutions or collective institutions? Because I'm wondering, when we think about how we, especially during this time, really
Hmm.
leverage our resources and our strengths. I'm just wondering what your thoughts of in terms of, is that a pursuit for an individual institution, or is that something that we could collectively engage or strategize around?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I wholeheartedly believe that we have to lean into collectivism and
Mhm,
collaboration.
mhm,
Uh, I think what in the HBCU sector, um, a lot of what we see as institutional and higher education sector is going to have to mirror Black community. And right now, community is going to be what is so important in sustaining
mhm,
and being able to be able to push through what's going to be tough times. There's
mhm,
no question we're about to hit tough times. I've said in multiple platforms, higher education is about to go through a really great, like really big stress test.
sure, really big.
And we know that if the larger ecosystem's going to hit it, we're going to really feel it in the HBCU
Sure.
sector. So I think this is the time to look at how we can collaborate. And I think if we look historically, that's how we've been able to make progress as a sector before, is finding those touch points and those opportunities to collaborate within the sector. I think that some of the challenges in kind of larger conversation in higher ed,
Mhm,
across higher ed, around enrollment
mhm,
and limited resources would seek to force us to see have HBCU see each other as competition,
right.
and I think that is a trick.
It is.
I do not think there is strength in going these paths alone. The strength is in sharing and pooling resources. um, I I I imagine how awesome it would be for a Howard to get in on or apply for a grant with a Hampton and a Morgan State, and maybe
Mhm,
even pull in
mhm,
you
mhm,
know, a Elizabeth City state,
mhm,
right? And have all these HBCUs as co-PIs and sharing resources, and being able to help build each other's capacity
mhm,
while doing the work, as opposed to trying to go it alone or having to share those resources with institutions that may not have their best interest in heart.
mhm,
So I really think coming together, working collective, thinking about the collective good will really be beneficial for the sector. And I think the beauty about HBCUs is that the infrastructure for that is already there.
mhm,
There's already, many of the presidents already know each
mhm,
other.
mhm,
A lot of these institutions already have storied histories
mhm,
with each
mhm,
other.
mhm.
So the infrastructure and that family ethos is
Sure,
already there, and it's taking that ethos and embedding it into some organizational strategies.
sure.
And I think if we're able to do that, if the sector is able to do that, I think everybody will benefit from that approach, as opposed to a few being able to
Mhm.
survive the storm at the peril of others, because we can't afford to lose one more,
Right,
right?
absolutely. That's
HBCU.
right.
And
Yep.
so, and for HBCUs, um, because of kind of anti-Black sentiments in our society,
Mhm.
um, if one is having challenges, the perception is they all are,
Yeah. Mhm,
right? So it would behoove us to make sure everybody's got
mhm.
a light to shine.
Sure, absolutely.
And so
And
I
also that we
definitely think collaboration is the key.
right. And also I think that we really need to focus on telling our story, because you're right, many
Absolutely.
HBCUs are doing this work. But often that story is sort of embedded in another institution story, probably not
Mm-hmm.
HBCU, or we just think about it the word. I mean, when you think about even health disparities, I mean, to me, and think about the work that we've done, I mean, historically, and certainly even right now, in terms of making sure that, illuminating the ways in which, um, health disparity, what that means in our communities, what that means for our nation and our world is really absolutely amazing. So we're doing the work, but actually being strategic about it. And also, as you're saying, this collaboration. One of the things I think, I was having an earlier conversation earlier with colleagues, and we were talking about this time, and it is a time for opportunities um, to be innovative, in terms of
Absolutely.
HBCUs, and to enact our agency in ways
Yeah.
perhaps that we didn't, and not to rely perhaps on dominant mainstream metrics and benchmarks um, to define us. I think we've done a good
Yeah.
job of that in some ways, but in other ways, we're still dependent. And that's we're not unique in that way
Right.
for other higher institutions, but certainly we are best able to articulate our worth, and
Yeah.
I think we can do that.
And I think the classification process or the revisiting of the classification process is proof of that. You had a number of HBCU presidents in the room. You
Mm-hmm.
had a number of HBCU advocates in the
Sure,
room.
sure.
And it was that push of because hopefully not giving away too much, but there there were conversations of like, well, maybe we'll just have an HBCU
Yes,
designation, right?
indeed.
Or a little,
Mhm.
and it was like, and it was those coming together saying we're not saying we want a set aside, right? We
There
don't
you
want to
go.
be in your
Right.
little some little
Exactly.
group here, but what we're saying is let's rethink the metrics, right? And rethink about them in a way in which what we value matters in this conversation. And so I do think, to your point, HBCU saying, we're not gonna be left out of this
Mhm,
conversation
mhm,
where
mhm,
you make metrics that
mhm.
don't consider the uniqueness of our institutions, and then we end up just running after something that was never designed for us to be
Right.
successful at,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
Um, but what we're saying, we're not saying we don't want metrics,
There
but
you
what
go.
we're saying is we want some say in the metrics. And I
That's right.
think the revisiting of the classification, which, if we're honest, benefit a lot of institutions,
Absolutely.
not just
Absolutely. That's right.
HBCUs.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
But a
Absolutely.
lot of the push came from
Mhm,
HBCUs, right?
mhm.
And so I think you're absolutely right, and that this is an opportunity for the institutions to define themselves for themselves as they've
Mhm.
done many times over and over again, and say, we understand we're in this larger ecosystem, but we're going to be have an active voice, and we want to have an
Sure.
active voice in being innovative, as you said, and how we decide what we do, how we do it, and how it will be measured.
We want to be full-fledged members of the ecosystems, which means
That's right.
having authentic engagement in that our perspectives, while they may not permeate every single aspect of every single decision, but
Right.
certainly there's some consider just like anybody else who's a full-fledged member of a
Right.
body. So absolutely makes a great deal of sense. Well, Dr. Commodore, again, thank you so much for um, being a part of this session. I didn't think we could do this session without your voice, so really
Oh, I
appreciate
appreciate
you being a
that.
part of it. So again, thank you so much, and we appreciate you, and look forward to a future discussion about this so important topic. Okay,
Yes.
thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Okay,
Thank
have a
you.
good day.
You too.